The night Harlow Beckett's husband handed her divorce papers at his own company's gala, he made sure to do it in front of everyone. Not in a corner, not quietly. He walked up to her with that particular smile he'd been wearing more and more lately, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and held out an envelope while Brittany stood 3 feet behind him in a red dress that cost more than Harlow's first car. "I think you already know what this is," Ethan said. She did. She'd suspected for 6 weeks. But suspecting and knowing are 2 different things, and Harlow felt the distance between them collapse all at once, right there under the chandeliers of the Pinnacle Hotel ballroom in downtown Toronto, with 200 colleagues watching her face. She took the envelope. She didn't open it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married 8 years ago in a small ceremony in Muskoka. This man she had cooked breakfast for and driven to the airport and stayed up with when his father was sick, and she said, very quietly, "Okay." That was all. She put the envelope in her clutch, picked up her champagne from the nearest table and walked to the coat check. What Ethan Marlowe did not know, what he had never bothered to find out in 8 years of marriage, was that Harlow hadn't been working as a regional marketing manager for the past 3 years. That title was a convenient fiction she'd maintained because it was easier than explaining the truth. The truth was that she was the sole silent partner and majority stakeholder of Callaway Venture Group, a private equity firm that had quietly acquired 11 mid-sized companies across Ontario and British Columbia since 2019. The truth was that her mother's death 4 years ago had left her with an inheritance so substantial that she had spent 2 years just figuring out what to do with it. The truth was that Harlow Beckett was by any reasonable financial measure worth somewhere in the range of $40 million. Ethan ran a tech company called Marlowe Systems. It had 63 employees, a decent client roster, and a cash flow problem it had been quietly managing for the past 18 months. Callaway Venture Group had been watching it for 6. She signed the papers 10 days later. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who had seen every variation of marital collapse in 30 years of family law, advised her to push for a longer settlement negotiation. Harlow declined. She had already moved into her own place, a furnished condo in Liberty Village she'd kept on a long lease for exactly these kinds of contingencies, and she had no interest in prolonging anything. "You're leaving money on the table?" Patricia said. "I know," Harlow said. "That's fine." What she did not tell Patricia because it wasn't relevant yet, was that she had authorized Callaway's acquisition team to proceed with Marlowe Systems the previous Thursday. The deal closed on a Tuesday. Ethan found out on a Wednesday. She heard about his reaction secondhand, from a former colleague named Jonah, who still worked at Marlowe and had always been quietly fond of Harlow. Jonah texted her a single message. "He's been in his office for 4 hours. He sent everyone home at noon. He looks like he's seen a ghost." Harlow read the message twice and then put her phone down and went back to her pasta. She hadn't always been this steady. That was the thing nobody understood from the outside, and the thing she herself had needed years to accept. Growing up, Harlow had been the kind of person who second-guessed everything. Her choices, her words, her right to take up space. Her mother had been a self-made woman of extraordinary discipline, and growing up in that shadow had left Harlow with the persistent feeling that she was always slightly behind where she should be. The inheritance hadn't changed her overnight. If anything, it had made things harder for a while. She'd spent the first year after her mother's death mostly numb, working with a financial advisor she trusted and slowly learning how to think about money at a scale she had never anticipated. She'd made mistakes. She'd been too cautious, then overconfident, then cautious again. She'd also somewhere in the middle of all that married Ethan. He had been charming in the early years, genuinely funny in a dry, understated way, smart about his industry. He'd never asked her about money, which she had foolishly taken as a sign of security in him rather than disinterest. Now she understood it differently. Ethan hadn't asked because Ethan had assumed. He had looked at her reasonable apartment and her sensible car and her mid-level job title and concluded that she was, like most people, exactly what she appeared to be. The first sign had been small. A dinner party at his colleague's place in Rosedale, 3 years into the marriage. Someone had asked Harlow what she was working on and she'd been vague as she usually was, and Ethan had said, light, almost joking, "She does marketing, nothing too complicated." He had looked at her when he said it with a particular expression she hadn't quite been able to name at the time. She could name it now. Condescension dressed up as affection. After that she started noticing other things. The way he spoke over her at dinners. The way he'd stopped asking her opinion on anything to do with his business. The way his mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Gail who lived in Burlington, had taken to asking Harlow in a very particular tone whether she was still doing the marketing thing every time they visited. Brittany had come later. Harlow had met her exactly once before the gala, A company event the previous spring where Brittany had been introduced as a new account manager. She was 29 and very pretty, and looked at Ethan with the specific attention of someone who had decided something. Harlow hadn't said anything. She'd made a note, the way she'd learned to make notes about things worth watching, and she'd gone home and looked out the window for a long time. The first board meeting at Marlowe Systems after the acquisition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. The weather had turned properly cold by then, the sky over Toronto that particular flat gray that settles in and doesn't leave until April. Harlow wore a navy blazer over a white shirt and drove herself. She had considered arriving late, decided against it. Arriving late was a performance. She wasn't interested in performances. Ethan was already in the boardroom when she walked in. She had known he would be. His role as CEO had been technically preserved through the transition period. Standard acquisition protocol. Nothing unusual. She had not told her team anything beyond the fact that she wanted professionalism and restraint in all communications. He looked up when she entered and went completely still. The boardroom had 8 other people in it. 2 of her people from Callaway, 5 Marlowe senior staff, and a corporate attorney. They had all been briefed. They were all watching the door. "Good morning," Harlow said to the room generally. She sat down at the head of the table. Ethan hadn't moved. He was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. A total blankness, like a screen that had gone dark mid-sentence. It lasted about 5 seconds and then something else moved through it, something complicated, and he looked down at the table. "Mr. Marlowe," she said, "thanks for being here." He looked up again. "Harlow M's Beckett will work fine," she said, not coldly, just as a fact. She opened the meeting. The next 2 weeks were a study in controlled discomfort. She did not avoid him, but she did not seek him out. She conducted herself exactly as she would have with any newly acquired company. Clearly, fairly, and with consistent expectations. She requested a full audit of Marlowe Systems' financials, which had as expected more problems than the surface presentation had suggested. She brought in 2 of her own people to run operations alongside the existing management team. She sat in on client meetings and asked careful, pointed questions that made clear she understood the business at a level nobody had anticipated. Ethan attended every meeting. He was, she noticed, not stupid. He adjusted quickly. He stopped trying to assert authority he no longer had and started paying attention instead, and she gave him credit for that privately, in the way she gave credit for small dignities even in difficult circumstances. His mother called her. This was unexpected. Gail had gotten her number from somewhere. Harlow suspected Ethan's sister, who had always been slightly warmer, and left a voicemail that Harlow listened to while standing in her kitchen on a Thursday evening. "Harlow, it's Gail. I think we should talk." A pause. "I know things have been complicated. Ethan's made mistakes. I'm not pretending otherwise. But he's my son, and Marlowe Systems is everything he's built, and I think you know that what you're doing isn't right. I hope you'll consider." Harlow deleted the message. She sat with it for a moment, the familiar weight of Gail's disapproval, transformed now into something desperate and entitled, and then she made herself a cup of tea and called her friend Simone, who was one of only 4 people who knew everything. "His mother called me," Harlow said. "Of course she did," Simone said. "What did she want? To tell me what I'm doing isn't right." Simone was quiet for a second. "What are you doing? Running a company I bought legally, right?" Simone said. "That's what I thought." The audit turned up what she had suspected. Systematic expense mismanagement over 3 years, a client billing irregularity that Harlow's legal team flagged as potentially actionable, and a pattern of preferential contracting that had directed significant business toward a company that turned out to be registered in Brittany's brother's name. Harlow read the report on a Sunday morning with her second coffee and felt something settle in her, flat and final. She called her lead attorney on Monday. She was precise about what she wanted: correct the irregularities, restructure the contracts, and document everything. Not aggressively, just completely. The attorney asked if she wanted to pursue the billing issue further. Harlow said she'd consider it. She said she'd consider a lot of things. What she did not want, and this was important to her, more important than most people would have understood, was revenge in the theatrical sense. She had no interest in a confrontation scene. She had no desire to watch Ethan crumble or to say things that would feel satisfying for 10 minutes and hollow for 10 years. That kind of revenge was for people who needed the other person to acknowledge what they'd done, and Harlow had stopped needing that somewhere in the 3rd week after the gala. When she'd realized that Ethan's understanding of his own wrongness was not actually necessary for her to move forward. What she wanted was simpler. She wanted Marlowe Systems to be run properly. She wanted the people who worked there, 59 of whom were not Ethan, not Brittany, not anyone who had done anything wrong, to have job security and fair management. She wanted, if she was honest, to prove something to herself, not to him, to herself. The formal restructuring happened 6 weeks after the acquisition closed. She brought in a new operations director, a woman named Charlotte who had run 2 successful turnarounds in the last decade and had a reputation for being direct without being unkind. She sat down with each department head individually. She conducted a compensation review and found, as she had expected, several significant disparities that she moved quickly to correct. Ethan's role was the hardest part. Not emotionally, that clarity had come early, but practically, there was a real question about what the company needed. The transition period had a defined end, and at the end of it, his continued leadership would need to be evaluated against what the company actually required. She had the conversation with him herself. She had considered delegating it and decided against it. That felt cowardly. He came into her office. She'd taken the corner one that had apparently been used for storage, on a Wednesday afternoon in November. He looked tired. He had lost some of the ease that had always been his most natural quality, that loose confidence that had probably been what she'd first noticed about him 10 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding in Stratford. "I know why I'm here," he said. "Then you know it's not personal." He looked at her. "It feels personal, Harlow." She considered that. "I'm sure it does," she said. "But the audit findings were what they were. The billing irregularities alone." "I know about the billing." "Then you understand why the board's position isn't negotiable." He was quiet for a moment. Outside it had started to rain. That fine, miserable November rain that came sideways off the lake. She watched him try to find something to say and find nothing. "I didn't think you were," he started. "I know," she said. "You didn't know." "I should have." That surprised her. She hadn't expected that. She looked at him with more attention. "Yes," she said after a moment. "You should have." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't a door reopening. It was just the truth, acknowledged between 2 adults in a gray November boardroom, and she thought that was probably enough. He left his keys on the desk when he walked out. Charlotte moved into the role formally in December, and by February Marlowe Systems had its best quarter in 3 years. 2 new clients had come on board following Charlotte's restructuring of the pitching process. 3 of the billing irregularities had been quietly resolved through repayment agreements. The company, which had been hemorrhaging quietly for 18 months, was stable. Harlow was not in the office every day. She didn't need to be. She checked in with Charlotte every week, reviewed the financials monthly, sat on the board quarterly. It was exactly what she had designed it to be. She moved out of the Liberty Village condo in March and bought a place near Leslieville. A solid century home with a narrow yard and enough room for the dog she had been putting off getting for 5 years. She got the dog in April. A large, slow-moving golden retriever named after no one in particular, who had no opinions about private equity and was excellent at sitting beside her while she worked. She didn't think about Ethan often. When she did, it was without the charge that had been there in the early months. The complicated mixture of grief and fury and something she was almost embarrassed to call hurt, though that's what it had been. It had simply faded into the neutral category of things that had happened. Not good, not formative in the dramatic sense. Just a chapter that had closed. Her friend Jonah texted occasionally with Marlowe Systems updates, then less, then stopped. In the natural way that connections maintained by proximity eventually shift. She heard secondhand through Patricia that Ethan had moved to Vancouver. She hoped, without irony, that he was doing all right. That was the part that kept surprising her, quietly, when she stopped to notice it. Not the money, which had never felt entirely real to her, not the professional satisfaction, though that was real enough, but just the uncomplicated dailiness of it. The Tuesday mornings with coffee and a spreadsheet and the dog asleep under the desk. The phone calls with her Callaway partners. The dinners with Simone and her other friends in a city that had always been hers more than it had ever been theirs. She had built something. She had protected it. And the man who had handed her a document at a gala to let everyone watch her face fall had handed her, without knowing it, the last clean reason she needed to stop waiting for permission to be exactly who she already was. She hadn't needed him to understand that. She'd only needed to understand it herself.